One of the things I'm going to maybe not be logical, but be digressive. One of the things about this book that's different from most of his other books, not all, but most, is that he deals with the female in an adult manner. And he did this in the Beach of Falesa, but here he does it in form of a love story. And I would say it's one of the most charming love stories in English fiction. As a matter of fact, not only do I say it, but Gary Wills said it, and I quoted him on the back of the book, Jack. And if Gary Wills says it, how can it be wrong? He's a great public intellectual who's written about who knows what. But that's another aspect of literary history that's often interesting for people who are not always aware of it. It doesn't always, demonstrate itself. Some things are known at a certain time, but over time, those things that are known suddenly disappear or get buried. When the book was published, many of Stevenson's friends and many reviewers commented on the love story. But over time, it sort of got forgotten. In the first part of the book is divided into two parts, part one, part two. In the first part, he meets Katrina, he obviously falls in love with her, and he's doing everything he can to sort of court her. But there's a lot more business that has to be undertaken. One of the things is he has to meet up with his great friend, Alan Breck Stewart. And he does this in, sort of outside Edinburgh, surreptitious, Alan Breck is still a wanted man. He meets him, and the chapters dealing with him, with Alan Breck, are marvelous. They're marvelous for their wit, for their, their insight. But Alan Breck, one of the things Alan Breck says to him, when he meets him, he says, David, he says, were you followed? So David says, no, I wasn't followed. So he says, how do you know? Because, of course, everybody's looking for them. So he says, well, I didn't see anybody behind me. And, of course, I didn't hear anybody. So Alan says, you blockhead. That's their job. It's their job not to be seen and not to be heard. How do you know you weren't seen and heard? Because you didn't see them? So this starts a long conversation, which I work out, with the word ken. A very small Scottish word, K-E-N, which, by the way, in the Outlanders is used over and over again, regularly. Well, ken means to know, of course, but if you look in the dictionary of the Scottish language, you can discover 23 or 24 different definitions for this little three-letter word. I'm not saying all these definitions show up in the dialogue between Alan and David, but knowing is also philosophically the idea of knowledge. How do we know? Epistemology is a philosophical field. And what Stevenson does is, in the figure of Alan, he has Alan replicate some old ideas about knowing. A wise man is a man who knows he knows nothing. You see. Now, Alan hasn't read that. Or Montaigne, who is one of Stevenson's favorite authors, who has a signature line that says, what do I know? In Alan's terms, is what do I ken? So Stevenson is using, because Stevenson had a strong interest in philosophy, it may even be called philosophy. Stevenson is using Alan, uneducated, a man simply of the world, to introduce and develop all of these philosophical ideas in his dialogue with his much more rational, his much more educated friend, David. Much of it is comic, but also much of it is... Alan, in effect, becomes a tutor for David. Just as he was in the earlier novel case, now he's tutoring him. When he discovers that David was bested in a presumed sword fight, he says, three times you lost your sword. This is absurd, and I who taught you. David says, well, you didn't really teach me that much. But, let it go. One of the things, again, I appreciate the laughter, because, you see, one of the things that Stevenson is not always regarded for is the fact of his humor. he is a very, very, I don't want to say funny, he's a very clever, sly, sardonic, witty writer. But it's really like caviar for the general. You know, it's dry, and you can't just, you know, get it immediately, but it's always there. He is a very, very, and in this case, in the chapters with Alan, this shows up dramatically. Now, Alan is a wonderful tutor because he's essentially an empiricist. He takes the world as it is. He deals with it as it is. David is always involved in abstract complications. His mind is constantly going over, well, can I do this? I mean, is it right? The very fact that he goes to the Duke, to the Lord Advocate, which is the equivalency of an Attorney General, and tells him, I want to go to court and I want to be a witness for the defense. The Attorney General, of course, is prosecuting this defendant, and Alan says, no, I'm going to be a witness for his defense. In other words, he's innocent. And Advocate says to him, what's wrong with you? He says, the man, whether he's innocent or not, is beside the point. He's a dead man. And David is forced to realize that the law is not a question of guilt or innocence. It's a question of might and power. And the advocate has the power. And the government wants to make sure that these Jacobites, or presumed Jacobites, are going to pay the price, and he doesn't care. And he certainly doesn't want some young kid coming up to him and telling him, I know that he's not guilty, and I want to go to court. I want my defense, presented in court. David, of course, represents a kind of what you would say conscience, moral responsibility, and yet these contraries, Preston Grange or the Advocate, is also, in a sense, a father for David. David, of course, is an orphan, and he's always finding these men who will sort of look out for him, or perhaps offer him some kind of guidance in the world. And so the Advocate takes him under his wing. But in a great line, David says at the end, he was kind to me as any father, yet I ever thought him as false as a cracked bell. He was kind to me as any father, yet I ever thought him as false as a cracked bell. And this returns us to a theme that is very common in Stevenson. Nobody, even the worst, are completely without some saving grace. In the Beecher Fale-Sa, the villain, Case, whom Wiltshire, the white trader, finally kills, was kind to his wife. And the minister wants to say some words upon his death, and Wiltshire can't stand it. He said, why are you saying anything? The guy was, out and out bad. Just let him rot in hell. Stevenson says he was kind to his wife. That doesn't absolve his behavior, but it shows that even the worst of us, sometimes, something good can be found in them. And in David Balfour, Katrina's father, who was really an unpleasant type of a man, he's certainly a bad father, and he's certainly, ambitious, and he's certainly capable of betrayal. And at the end, when he dies, David thinks to himself, I have to put something on his stone. And he can't think of anything good to say, but he does feel that he needs to have something, so he puts the dates. At least dates don't lie, which is another digression, which gives you, from my point of view, it's an attitude that I see reflected in a writer like Ernest Hemingway, who I think was not someone who wrote about Stevenson the way Steinbeck did, but someone who I think whose attitude towards fiction was very much in line with Stevenson's. The things that you could say that were clear and that were incapable of being bent were really the thing, was the best kind of writing. Stevenson, late in his life, said, there are certain principles of writing. He says, one is, the best art is the art to omit. To omit is the best art. In other words, if you can leave it out, you're doing a good job. Where he said, death to the adjective, death to the optic nerve. And he writes to Henry James and he says, I want to write in such a way that I'm writing, my style is something like a cross between a ledger book and a ballad. So you see, Stevenson, from the point of view of prose fiction, was aiming for a kind of style that we know subsequently was called modernism, and that would be exemplified in a writer like Hemingway. But of course, in his own day, this was not always recognized. And I also make a point, or I throw out the suggestion that by the time of David Balfour, Stevenson is in what I call a late style. Now you see, it's very common to talk about Henry James having a late style because Henry James lived a long life. He wrote a great many books, and it's easy to go from the Portrait of a Lady to the Ambassadors of the Golden Bow and see a great change in the writing. With Stevenson, he lived much shorter. The writing career doesn't span any more than maybe 20, 30 years, 20 years actually at the maximum. And so the idea of breaking that up into an early style, or at least one style, and then a later style, seems somewhat, presumptuous. But I think it's the case nonetheless. Anyway, let me jump forward. Part 1, David is getting his introduction to Edinburgh, and then he winds up spending a couple of months at the advocate's house, and now he is being finished. He learns to fence, he learns French, he even learns a little dancing. He becomes really someone who can take his place in the world as a sophisticated young man, cosmopolitan, and able to hold his own. Part 1. Part 2, which is where the love story comes about, is where it takes place in Holland, travels in Holland. I'm not going to repeat the plot, but in effect, David and Katrina wind up traveling to Holland, going traveling by foot to get to Leiden, where David is going to study law. She has no money. He's helping to oversee. He's overseeing her as a protector. It's a marvelous set of chapters. It also, what Stevenson does, is echoes Kidnapped. There was a flight in the Heather in Kidnapped. In David Balfour, you have these flights, these travels through Holland in which Katrina and David are replicating or echoing the path that was taken by Alan and David in the first book. There's a scene where Katrina has to be transferred from this boat into a little dinghy that comes alongside. Nobody wants to go with her. Everybody says, stay in the boat and we'll drop you off someplace else, but she insists she has to get to this town. So David says, I'll go with you. He's going to be the brave escort. He gets up on the edge of the boat and he jumps into the dinghy. And of course he does a pratfall, he falls on his face. But Katrina, not to be outdone, she gets up and she stands and she leaps after him, and of course she lands straight up. Now Katrina is a great character. As a matter of fact, I would say he's probably Stevenson's, I think, greatest female creation. Now Barbara Grant in the book is also wonderful, and it may be silly to make differences, but she is a marvelous figure. And her portrait comes out and is drawn out with great detail and subtlety in this section. It's a brilliant portrait. She's, of course, brilliant. She's courageous. She has a singular speech. David says she had a hill voice, spoke with something of an English accent, only far more delightful. You will see it when you read the book. If you read the book, there is something really remarkably attractive about Katrina's speech. And of course what Stevenson is doing is Stevenson is trying to replicate a certain kind of Highland speech patterns. He wasn't a linguist, but he had a very good ear, and he was able to replicate a certain pattern of speech